In 1884, a woman named Sarah Winchester arrived in California carrying one of the largest private fortunes in the United States, a fortune generated not by land or railroads, but by the most successful repeating rifle of the 19th century. Within 2 decades, she would begin constructing a house that never reached completion, not for a year, not for a decade, but for nearly 38 continuous years, expanding through the collapse of the Gilded Age, the turn of the 20th century, and into the early modern era of American history. By the time construction finally stopped in 1922, the structure contained more than 160 rooms, thousands of windows, staircases that led nowhere, doors that opened into walls, and a layout so fragmented that even today it resists simple explanation. Most people are told this house is mysterious. Some are told it is haunted, but those stories begin far too late. Because the real question is not why this house was strange, but how American history produced a situation where something like this could exist at all. That answer has nothing to do with ghosts, and everything to do with wealth, grief, and a moment in time when nothing forced certain lives to stop, settle, or make sense. If this kind of slow, history-driven storytelling is something you want more of, take a second to like the video and subscribe. It helps this channel keep producing long-form stories that don't rush to explain themselves. And before we begin, I'm curious, where are you watching from right now? Let me know in the comments, because this story may be rooted in California, but its meaning stretches far beyond one house. Long before anyone described this place as mysterious, before tour guides learned which details to emphasize and which legends to repeat, before the house itself became the point of the story, there was a period in American history where building without limits was not unusual at all. The late 19th century was an era defined by momentum rather than restraint, a time when fortunes appeared faster than systems could understand them, when entire industries were born, expanded, and consolidated within a single lifetime. Railroads stitched the continent together, factories replaced workshops, and wealth accumulated at a scale that had never existed before in the United States. This was not an age that rewarded balance. It rewarded speed, expansion, and repetition. Things that worked were not refined, they were multiplied. Success did not slow people down, it removed friction, and when friction disappeared, behavior changed in ways that were not immediately visible, but deeply structural. California, in particular, embodied this condition. It was still a relatively young state, shaped more by extraction than tradition, more by opportunity than inheritance. Gold had already demonstrated how quickly value could appear and vanish, and the industries that followed learned from that lesson. They moved aggressively, scaled quickly, and measured success almost entirely by output. In this environment, permanence was not created by careful planning, but by continuous motion. Buildings went up fast, towns expanded unevenly, entire landscapes were reshaped not because someone had designed them that way, but because money allowed processes to continue without interruption. It was a place where limits felt optional, where growth itself became a form of justification. And within that cultural atmosphere, it was entirely possible for a structure to exist that was never forced to ask what it was becoming. At the same time, this was an era deeply uncomfortable with endings. Victorian America developed elaborate rituals around death, not because it accepted loss easily, but because it struggled to process it. Mourning was formalized, extended, and ritualized. Black clothing was worn for years. Homes were altered to reflect absence. Entire industries arose to manage grief in socially acceptable ways. Spiritualism flourished not as fringe belief, but as mainstream practice, discussed openly in parlors and newspapers, embraced by educated families who saw no contradiction between industrial progress and metaphysical curiosity. The idea that communication could continue beyond loss was not considered irrational. It was considered hopeful, and hope, when paired with wealth, often takes physical form. Against this backdrop, the story that would eventually become attached to this house was not yet strange. It was quiet. It unfolded privately, without spectacle. A woman moved west. Construction began. Workers came and went. The structure expanded. Years passed. There were no announcements, no architectural manifestos, no grand declarations about what the building would one day be. It simply continued. Additions were made not to impress the public, but to respond to an internal rhythm that no one outside the property fully understood. Unlike the great estates of the East Coast, this was not a project meant to anchor a family name across generations. Unlike public buildings, it was not meant to symbolize civic pride. It existed for reasons that were never articulated to an audience, which meant it was never shaped by one. What makes this period essential to understand is that nothing about it initially appeared excessive. The United States was full of large houses built by newly wealthy families attempting to translate financial success into permanence. Construction crews were readily available. Materials were plentiful. Expansion was normal. Renovation was constant. A house growing year after year did not automatically signal instability. In many cases, it signaled prosperity. The difference here was not size, but duration, not extravagance, but continuity. This was not a project that escalated toward completion. It moved forward without reference to one. And because there was no external pressure forcing it to conclude, no moment where economics, reputation, or inheritance demanded resolution, the process itself became the structure's defining feature. From the outside, time passed normally. Decades came and went. The country changed. Technologies advanced, social norms shifted. But inside this project, time behaved differently. It was not measured in eras, but in additions, not in milestones, but in persistence. The house did not grow in response to events. It grew because growth had become its default state, and that is the condition that would later make it so difficult to explain. Because when people encounter the house today, they look for intention where there was only continuation. They look for symbolism where there was only momentum. They look for mystery because the idea that something could exist simply because nothing ever stopped, it feels unsatisfying, almost offensive to the way history is usually told. By the time the house began attracting attention, by the time stories started to circulate and explanations were demanded, the structure was already the result of decades of uninterrupted decision-making. Whatever clarity once existed at the beginning had been absorbed into layers of modification. Meaning had not been destroyed, it had been diluted. And when meaning becomes too diffuse to trace, people replace it with narrative. They invent reasons proportional to the scale of what they're trying to understand. That is how ordinary processes become legends. That is how history, when left without context, starts to feel supernatural. And that is why this story cannot begin with the house itself, but with the conditions that allowed something so unresolved to take shape in the first place. The person at the center of this story did not set out to become a symbol, and certainly not a spectacle. She was born into a world that offered women very little formal authority, but she entered adulthood at a moment when American capitalism was beginning to bend traditional rules in unexpected ways. Her education was thorough by the standards of the time. She was articulate, observant, and socially capable, moving within circles that valued discretion and self-control over public display. Nothing about her early life suggested eccentricity. Nothing marked her as unstable or driven by impulse. In fact, what defined her most clearly was restraint. She lived within expectations, followed conventions, and appeared outwardly unremarkable in a society that prized exactly that. Which is why the transformation that followed cannot be understood as a sudden break, but as a gradual shift caused by forces accumulating faster than anyone around her could interpret. Loss arrived early and with devastating finality. Her infant child died only weeks after birth, a death that would have been emotionally catastrophic in any era, but was particularly isolating in one that rarely spoke openly about grief. Not long after, her husband, the person through whom her life was most closely connected to industry and ambition, fell ill and died as well. Within a short span of time, she moved from being a wife and mother into a state of social invisibility that Victorian culture did not know how to address. Widows were expected to retreat, to mourn quietly, to reduce themselves. But her circumstances made that retreat incomplete, because what remained after the deaths was not just grief, but ownership, control. A financial position so large it removed the usual pressures that shaped how people rebuilt their lives after loss. The inheritance she received did not arrive as a symbolic fortune. It arrived as an operational one, money that moved continuously, income that arrived daily, wealth that did not sit idle, but flowed. The scale of it was difficult even for contemporaries to comprehend. It did not require management in the traditional sense because it did not require urgency to preserve it, no obligation to grow it. It simply existed, replenishing itself faster than it could be exhausted. This altered the structure of decision-making in subtle but profound ways. When money functions as a boundary, it forces choice. When it ceases to function that way, choice becomes weightless. Actions no longer need justification. Reversals no longer require explanation. And when this condition persists over years rather than moments, behavior begins to change without anyone consciously intending it to. It was under these conditions that she relocated west, not as an act of escape, but of quiet reorientation. California offered distance from established social scrutiny and proximity to a culture more comfortable with reinvention. It was a place where large projects did not demand historical justification, where expansion was not yet burdened by tradition. She did not announce her arrival. She did not position herself as a public figure. She simply purchased land and began building. What started as a conventional home soon entered a different rhythm. Construction did not pause after completion. It adjusted, expanded, redirected. Workers were kept on continuously, not because there was a clear end goal, but because there was no reason to stop. This was not extravagance in the theatrical sense. It was persistence enabled by means. What is critical to understand is that none of this violated the logic of the time. Wealthy Americans built large homes. They renovated constantly. They modified their environments to reflect changing needs, tastes, and circumstances, but most eventually reached a point where stability asserted itself. Families grew, responsibilities consolidated, estates settled into form. In this case, that stabilizing pressure never arrived. There was no spouse to negotiate with, no children to design around, no public role that required coherence. The house became the primary site where internal conditions expressed themselves externally. Not dramatically, but incrementally. Each addition made sense in isolation. Each modification responded to a moment rather than a plan. Over time, those moments accumulated into something that no longer resembled a residence shaped by ordinary life. Grief played a role here, but not in the way it is often portrayed. There is no evidence of panic, terror, or frantic belief driving the process. Instead, there is continuity, routine. Construction became a constant, a background hum that filled days that might otherwise have demanded confrontation with stillness. In an era before therapy, before grief was treated as something to be processed rather than endured, activity itself became a form of management. The house did not grow because she feared something. It grew because it allowed life to continue without requiring answers. And when resources are sufficient to support that avoidance indefinitely, avoidance can take architectural form. By the time observers began noticing the scale and irregularity of the structure, the process had already been underway for years. Explanations were offered from the outside, shaped by the cultural vocabulary available at the time. Spiritualism, eccentricity, obsession. These labels attempted to impose narrative coherence on something that had developed without it. What they missed was that the house was not being built to communicate anything outwardly. It was not a message. It was an environment shaped by conditions few people ever experience. Prolonged grief combined with unlimited means and complete autonomy. The resulting structure did not express madness. It expressed the absence of interruption. This distinction matters because it reframes everything that follows. If the house were the product of delusion, it could be dismissed. If it were the product of belief, it could be categorized. But if it was the product of a life in which nothing applied sufficient pressure to force resolution, then it becomes something else entirely. It becomes evidence of what happens when human systems operate without constraint long enough to solidify into form. By the end of this period, the house was no longer simply a residence under construction. It was a physical record of time passing without correction. And once a structure reaches that state, the story no longer belongs only to the person who built it. It begins to reflect the society that made such a life possible. By the time the wider public became aware of the house, it was already too complex to explain cleanly. Decades of uninterrupted construction had produced a structure that no longer resembled a single idea, and when something resists simple interpretation, people tend to reach for explanations that feel proportional to its scale. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, spiritualism provided exactly that kind of framework. It was not a fringe movement operating on the margins of society, but a widespread cultural phenomenon embraced by scientists, politicians, writers, and industrialists. Seances were hosted in respectable homes. Mediums advertised openly in newspapers. The belief that communication could persist beyond death was not considered irrational. It was considered progressive. Within that environment, it became easy, almost inevitable, for observers to connect a continuously expanding house, a wealthy widow, and a period of extended mourning into a single supernatural narrative. What rarely gets acknowledged is how much of that narrative was constructed after the fact. There is no contemporary documentation showing that the house was built according to spirit instructions, no verified records of architectural plans dictated by unseen forces, no evidence that construction choices followed any consistent symbolic system. What does exist are payroll records, building permits, material orders, and testimony from workers who described a site that was active, organized, and professionally managed. The house did not resemble a ritual space. It resembled a long-term project that never transitioned into maintenance mode. The mythology that later attached itself to the structure did not emerge because the evidence demanded it, but because the evidence resisted every simpler explanation people preferred. Understanding the house requires stepping away from the question of belief and looking instead at process. Construction continued because there was no economic reason for it to stop. Modifications occurred because nothing penalized inefficiency. Design reversals happened because there was no cost to undoing previous work. In most buildings, architecture hardens because resources force decisions to become final. Walls exist because moving them is expensive. Layouts persist because change requires justification. In this case, none of those constraints applied. The house remained soft. It never crystallized into a finished form because finishing was not necessary. What appears today as irrational complexity is, in historical terms, the result of architectural liquidity extended over an unusually long period. This reframing also changes how grief should be understood in the context of the house. Grief did not produce spectacle here. It produced continuity. In a culture that lacked formal mechanisms for emotional processing, sustained activity became a substitute for resolution. Construction provided rhythm. It created forward motion without demanding closure. When combined with wealth that removed urgency, that rhythm could persist indefinitely. The house did not expand in response to fear or prophecy. It expanded because continuation itself had become stabilizing. Stopping would have required a confrontation with stillness that no external force demanded. As the 20th century approached and the original conditions that allowed the house to grow began to fade from public memory, the structure itself became increasingly detached from its context. New observers encountered it without understanding the economic and cultural environment that produced it. What they saw were architectural contradictions without visible cause, doors that led nowhere, staircases that reversed direction, rooms stacked without coherence. These features did not feel like the byproducts of process. They felt intentional, and once intention is assumed, motive must be supplied. Supernatural explanations filled the gap left by historical amnesia. The irony is that the truth is more unsettling than the myth. A haunted house implies intrusion, an external force acting upon a structure. This house was shaped entirely from within. Nothing invaded it, nothing compelled it. Every addition was approved, every alteration was funded, every reversal was permitted. The building reflects not chaos, but accumulation without resistance. It is not a monument to belief, but to a system in which decision-making was never forced to resolve itself. When people describe the house as haunted, they are responding not to spirits, but to the discomfort of encountering a place where cause and effect have been stretched beyond their usual limits. By the time construction finally ceased, the house had already become something its builder never explicitly named. It was no longer a home in the conventional sense, nor a deliberate work of architecture. It was an artifact of prolonged autonomy, and artifacts once separated from their origins invite interpretation. Tourists arrived, stories circulated, guides repeated anecdotes that filled gaps left by missing context. Over time, those stories hardened into canon. The house became mysterious because mystery was more marketable than explanation. A narrative about ghosts traveled more easily than a narrative about wealth, grief, and the absence of constraint. Yet when the mythology is stripped away, the underlying structure remains deeply revealing. The house demonstrates what happens when economic power removes natural stopping points from human behavior. It shows how environments can become distorted, not through excess alone, but through duration. A single renovation does not produce strangeness. Hundreds of uninterrupted decisions do. What looks deliberate in retrospect often began as a series of ordinary choices made under extraordinary conditions. The house is unsettling because it exposes a truth people rarely confront. Without limits, systems do not collapse immediately. They persist. They thicken. They become difficult to read. And by the time explanation is demanded, the original logic has already dissolved. This is why attempts to categorize the house as an expression of madness or superstition ultimately fail. Those explanations place the anomaly in the individual, allowing society to distance itself from the conditions that made the anomaly possible. But the house was not an aberration produced by a broken mind. It was the natural outcome of a life shaped by loss, autonomy, and uninterrupted means. It is not a warning about belief. It is a warning about what happens when structure is never required to settle. And once that perspective takes hold, the house stops feeling strange in a supernatural way and starts feeling unsettling in a historical one, because it reveals a pattern that extends far beyond a single property, into the foundations of how wealth and meaning interact over time. By the time the house entered public memory as a destination rather than a private space, the conditions that created it had largely disappeared. The era that allowed a single individual to reshape a structure indefinitely without scrutiny was giving way to a new relationship between wealth, visibility, and justification. Progressive reforms began demanding accountability from industry. Architecture professionalized, building codes standardized, zoning laws imposed boundaries that had once been negotiable. The kind of uninterrupted autonomy that shaped this house became increasingly rare, not because society grew wiser, but because it grew more regulated. The house survived into a world that no longer produced its kind, which made it feel out of place, almost anachronistic, as though it belonged to a different logic that history had quietly abandoned. Yet the impulse behind it never disappeared. It simply changed form. The house stands today not as a unique anomaly, but as an early and unusually honest expression of a pattern that would repeat across the American landscape in less obvious ways. As wealth concentrated and technology accelerated, people continued to build beyond necessity, expand beyond function, and accumulate space without meaning. The difference is that later expressions of this pattern were smoothed, rationalized, and marketed. Excess learned how to disguise itself as optimization. Scale learned how to call itself efficiency. What the Winchester House revealed openly, modern development learned to conceal behind symmetry and polish. This is why the house still unsettles people, even when its legends are explained away. It does not unsettle because it is confusing, but because it is transparent. It shows what happens when growth is allowed to replace purpose without resistance. In most contexts, systems collapse before they reach this stage. Budgets fail, families intervene, regulations step in. In this case, none of those mechanisms arrived in time. The house reached a point where it no longer communicated intention clearly. And once that happens, interpretation rushes in to fill the silence. Ghost stories, curses, and myths become more comforting than the alternative explanation that human systems, when left unchecked, can produce outcomes that feel unnatural even though they are entirely natural. The building's survival into the present reinforces this discomfort. Preserved, maintained, and toured, it now exists as both artifact and attraction. Visitors move through spaces that were never designed to be explained, guided by narratives constructed long after the original context vanished. The house functions less as a residence than as a mirror, reflecting whatever assumptions people bring with them. Some see madness, some see mystery, some see art. What few see is process. What few recognize is that the house is not strange because of what was believed within it, but because of what was never required of it. No moment demanded resolution, no structure forced coherence, no consequence insisted on finality. In this sense, the house belongs less to architectural history than to social history. It documents a moment when wealth temporarily outran interpretation, when private life expanded faster than public understanding, when a single person could act continuously without needing to narrate those actions to anyone else. The house is unsettling because it reveals the gap between action and meaning, a gap that usually remains invisible because it is corrected quickly. Here, it was allowed to widen until the result no longer resembled the intentions that created it. The transformation of the house into a tourist site did not restore that meaning. It replaced it. Legends offered clarity where history offered ambiguity. Stories imposed order where the original process had none. In doing so, they made the house easier to consume, but less honest. The true lesson of the structure does not lie in its oddities, but in its ordinariness taken too far. There was no single moment where the house became strange. There was only accumulation, decision after decision, each individually reasonable, each unchallenged, solidifying into a form that now feels impossible to explain. This pattern should feel familiar. Not because most people live in houses like this, but because the logic that produced it continues to shape modern environments. Large homes with unused rooms, cities that expand without cohesion, systems that persist long after their purpose fades because nothing forces them to stop. The Winchester House does not warn against belief or grief or eccentricity. It warns against momentum without reflection, against continuity without pause, against a world where growth is treated as self-justifying. In the end, the house does not need to be solved. It does not need to be decoded or demystified. Its power lies in what it exposes rather than what it hides. It stands as a rare physical record of a life lived without sufficient interruption, preserved long enough for others to encounter the consequences. The structure endured. The context vanished. What remains is a building that feels haunted not by spirits, but by the absence of an ending. That is why it lingers in the mind long after the tour ends. Not because it frightens, but because it destabilizes an assumption people rarely question, that accumulation leads somewhere, that continuity produces meaning, that growth naturally resolves into purpose. This house disproves that quietly, without spectacle. It simply stands there more complete in its incompleteness than many buildings that were finished exactly as planned. And in doing so, it offers a final, unsettling reminder: not everything that survives was ever meant to be finished.